Oh, Louie. What have you done, son? What have you done? Um, the reason I'm recording for you guys from 2006, as a YouTube commentator once said hilariously, is because there's no show until Monday, and I didn't want to wait until Monday to discuss this. um, I'm also gonna get into the Roy Moore stuff. Not in this video. I'll do a separate video for that, but don't worry, I haven't missed that story. There's a lot of sexual assault stories that leak on the same day. It was kind of strange. But I want to talk about this Louis C.K. thing for a second. So, Louis C.K., there have been rumors about Louis C.K. for a while. Apparently, in Hollywood and in comedy circles, it's been like an open secret for a while that he's got, some creepy stuff going on. And now there was a story in the New York Times that came out that was basically, giving details and putting faces to the accusations. So people, finally came out and spoke about exactly what the deal is. So I'm not going to get into the details. If you guys want, you can go read the New York Times article about this. At least as of right now, there's, I think, 5 different women who are accusing him of, and I don't even know the right word for it, sexual misconduct, sexual assault. But just to give you the Cliff Notes version of it, because again, we don't need to get into the specifics. Apparently, his thing, allegedly, is he would jerk off in front of people. Unwilling participants. I think one case it was like he called somebody into a room for a meeting when he was a writer on a different show, and he started jerking off. Another one is almost like a Weinstein-esque move where you invite people for, what they think is like a business get-together, whether it's at, I don't know if he did the Weinstein thing where Weinstein said, oh, come to the restaurant, and then like when they show up, the people at the front desk are like, oh no, he actually is up in his hotel room and he wants you to meet him there. I don't know if Louis C.K. did that, but he met with 2 women in his hotel room, and apparently he was like, do you guys mind if I like take out my penis? And they're like, what? And then he just took it out and started jerking off. I don't know. I mean, it's a gross conversation because I don't know how honestly the mechanics of it work. Like, what does he do? He would take it out and jerk off and nut in like 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then the women are like, what just happened? Like, I didn't agree to this. I'm not okay with this. But yeah, apparently that's his thing. His thing is like getting women alone, and according to them, they're unwilling participants, and he would just jerk off in front of them. Another one was a phone call he made to somebody who I think he knew the person's boyfriend or husband or whatever, and it was like a business call, but she heard him like breathing heavy, and then he started talking about like his sexual fantasies, and he would be jerking off on the other end of the line, and she was like, I had no idea what to do. So, it took me all this time. I'm fucking 29 years old, and like it just hit me the other day, and that's sad because it shows how slow I am. But, like, now I understand that, like, apparently there's a large segment, not a large segment, I don't know the number, I have no idea what the number is, but there's a certain percentage of the population that their whole thing is that they get off when people are unwilling participants. You know what I mean? Like, that's Louis C.K.'s compulsion, is I want to see that the other person is uncomfortable and seemingly not wanting to partake in what's going down. And that's like, that's sad, man. That's really sad. That's really, really sad. Because how does that happen? Is it one of those things that, I don't know, you're born with? And you just have this thing where the only way you get your rocks off is if somebody is seemingly uncomfortable or not partaking in the sex act in question? Or is it something that you pick up at some point somehow in your formative years as a child? You have some experience that leads you to believe that, I don't know, people who don't want to partake are somehow sexier or more attractive to you. I don't know what it is, but that, like, so it strikes me in the case of Louis C.K., it's a compulsion thing. Of course, assuming all the allegations are true. Now, in the case of, like, Weinstein, that strikes me as almost like a power dynamic where it's exploitative and manipulative and coercive on purpose. Like, they built it into some of Weinstein's contracts where, you know, they describe how, I think O'Reilly had this in his contract too, that, like, for a certain number of allegations, there's a certain amount of payoff. You know, like, if they accuse you of X, you pay out X amount. If they accuse you of Y, you pay out this amount. So it's almost like for a guy like Weinstein, it was like his whole thing was, well, look, if you want to play ball in Hollywood, here's the way it works. It's almost like he had like a menu that was like, if you jerk me off, you get a C-list role. If you give me head, you get a B-list role. If you go all the way, you get an A-list role. And a good point that somebody made was, you're only seeing the people who rejected him and were offended by that. You know what I mean? And we all heard the audio, and that was a monstrous audio where he's like trying to basically almost drag the woman into his hotel room. Weinstein's thing was like, oh, meet me in the restaurant and we'll talk about your career. And then when the people got there, the people at the hotel would say, no, he's actually in his room. We want you to meet him in his room. And he'd be waiting in a fucking bathrobe, you know? And he would, you know, in the audio we heard, there's one poor woman who he's basically trying to like drag in. And it's a power dynamic with them where it's like they're trying to exploit these young actresses who want to make it, and they're using sex. They're saying, look, if you fuck me, you're going to make it far, basically. And, you know, that there's a power problem there. Like, I don't know what counts as a bad pickup versus unethical but not illegal versus totally illegal. You know what I mean? Like, there's a fucking weird-ass gray area. And even in the case of, like, Bill Cosby, so I think he's guilty, and I think that, because there's like 1,000 accusers of him. And I think many of them, you know, were literally like he just drugged them and raped them when they were fucking unconscious, and they had no idea. That's like rape 101. He's a mass serial raper. But then other people muddy the waters because there are people that, like, had relationships with him who said, oh yeah, he did this to me like 37 times. It's like, wait, what? So you went out with him once and then he did this to you, and then, like, you went out with him again on Tuesday? Like, no, if you if somebody does that to you, you don't go see them again, obviously. And in the case of Weinstein, again, you're hearing about the ones who didn't want any of it. How many of them were totally playing ball the whole time? So with Weinstein, it struck me as a power play. With Louis C.K., it strikes me as more of a compulsion than a power play, where it's almost like he knows, because a lot of his comedy, you see it come out where, okay, that's not the right phrasing for this conversation. In a lot of his comedy, you see almost like he's kind of slyly, cleverly, in a subtext, admitting to all of how flawed he thinks he is and how bad he thinks he is, and almost like he knows how terribly wrong this is. And that's the thing, is like, I think he's smart enough to realize that this is all terrible, but he did it anyway. So if that's the case, then the only thing I could take away from that is it's a fucking compulsion. And that doesn't mean there shouldn't be any, punishment or justice for it. Of course there should be. But it's a stark and sad realization when you think like, oh, there are people who are otherwise totally normal, and in some ways, a superstar he is. He's extraordinary in a way, but he had this dark side to him where, he apparently couldn't stop jerking off in front of people who didn't want it. So all this fucking tidal wave of sex assault. And I was talking to my friend about it, and he's admittedly from like a different political perspective and outlook on the world than me. And what's funny is his take on it is so different. It's almost like he there's so much of this stuff coming out that his takeaway is like it feels super witch hunty in his opinion. I don't really agree with him because, like, again, so the example I just gave, sure, I think there are many instances of, like, even with Bill O'Reilly, I'm sure some of the people who are claiming, oh, he, whatever, assaulted me or something, sexually assaulted me, I'm sure some of them were like, they were in a consensual relationship with him, now they regret it, and now they're piling onto the list of people who he actually assaulted kind of thing. You know what I mean? So I think that there are some instances of people muddying the waters and, they may have, they may not be okay now with what at the time was a consensual relationship, and they're kind of piling on and almost delegitimizing the real criticisms and the real accusations against them. I think that exists, but I honestly believe, quite different from my friend who I was talking to about this, that yeah, it does look like there's a kind of a systemic problem. How in the case of guys like Weinstein and O'Reilly, it's using your power to manipulate and exploit and coerce, and it's almost like pay to play for your career. If you get me off, then you get this far. And, is that something that's just unethical but not illegal, or is that something that's totally illegal, and how do we address it? And in the case of Louis C.K. here, this strikes me less as a power thing but more of a compulsion thing. But it makes me sad that that's a thing that exists. It's a thing that exists that dudes, like, it's a dark way to think of it, but like, think of you listening right now, whatever you're into sexually. I don't know. I know that fucking 85% of my audience is males. So what are you? Are you into, I don't know, women who are brunettes who have big tits or whatever? I don't know. But like, that's the thing that gets you going. It's a scary thought to think that there's people out there, and Louis C.K. might be an example of this, of like the whole thing that gets him going is when a woman's like, no, I don't want to participate, and I'm super uncomfortable, and I'm an unwilling participant in this. And then they have the face of like, what are you doing? And that's the thing that gets him hard and gets him off. Oh man, is that a scary thought? But yeah, I hope, I don't even know, how would you bring justice in these circumstances? But I hope all the women who were wronged, who were sexually assaulted, I hope there's justice. And I think that many of the accusations against guys like Cosby and O'Reilly and Weinstein are true. I don't think all of them are true, but I think that a lot of them in each case are true. Unfortunately, the situation with Louis C.K., they also could be true. But man, it's such a landslide, a tsunami, a fucking waterfall of accusations all at once, and it's almost like we're lifting the veil off this institutional problem. Because back in the day, I don't want to drag on and on about this, which I'm already doing, but back in the day, like, you get the sense that in, like, seriously, like in 1950, 1960, like, everybody was Weinstein in these situations. Everybody. And that's a terrible thought. It's a terrible thought that, like, if you're a woman in Hollywood, the idea was, no, the only way you make it is to suck off fat, old, ugly men. Like, that's the only way you can make it. It's like, what? So it's not at all an attempt to try to be a meritocracy on this front. And, that's one of the things Weinstein said, by the way. And that doesn't at all excuse it, because it appears that he genuinely sexually harassed or assaulted a lot of these women. But one of the things he said was like, oh, yeah, there's something about, like, things have changed over the years or something to that effect. In other words, yeah, like in 1950, every single motherfucker was doing this. That's the whole game was, okay, do sex acts with me, and then I'll try to advance your career. Yeah, something feels super wrong about that. Like, gatekeepers who are old, wealthy, powerful men who are like, well, this is the way you climb the ladder. So in other words, it doesn't matter. You could be the best actress ever, but if you're not going to play ball in that respect, then with many of these guys, you don't get anywhere. Back in the day, it was probably almost 100%. Today, I don't know how high the percentage is, but if all these accusations are true, then perhaps it's more than somebody who's naive like me thought it was. So, and by the way, yes, I know, because there's going to be a crowd who screams, like, innocent until proven guilty, innocent until proven guilty, innocent until proven guilty. Yes, I know that. I fucking know that. I know that. I know that. That's the way the justice system works, and that's the way it should work. I get it. Everybody fucking gets it. But that doesn't mean that we're not allowed to have conversations about the underlying issues. That doesn't mean that we're not allowed to talk about these things without adding 314 hedges and caveats, well, allegedly. We all get it. That's fucking grandfathered into the conversation here, but yeah, it's sad, because Louis C.K., I think, is a super talented comedian, but, he had this dark side, has this dark side. He hasn't responded yet, at least as of the point of me making this video. But we'll see if he does. So, in summation, I don't know, I do think there's a real problem here. In the case of, like, the Weinsteins and the O'Reillys, it was almost like they tried to bake it into the way Fox News functioned. They tried to, with Roger Ailes, we know that's the case. They tried to bake it into the way Hollywood functions and their movies function, where it's almost like, well, that's the way it works. You have to do X, Y, and Z to get a job. And in the case of Louis C.K., it just struck me as more of a really sad compulsion that he knows is wrong, but he perhaps, exercised anyway. So, don't worry, we'll get to the Roy Moore thing next, because the Roy Moore thing is, there's another layer to the Roy Moore thing, and it's the hypocrisy. And I think that's the thing that pisses me off more than anything. Louis C.K., if all this stuff is true, what he did is horrendous. But there was a lot of, hints that he knew it was wrong, but he was doing it, which makes it, terrible compulsion. With Roy Moore, I mean, he'd go, 1,000 miles an hour down the fucking hypocrisy slide. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but Louis C.K., in the words of somebody who's very powerful at the moment, sad. Boom, everybody. Right as I was about to upload the segment on Louis C.K., we get this. He just released a statement. He says, I want to address the stories told to the New York Times by 5 women named Abby, Rebecca, Dana, Julia, who felt able to name themselves and one who did not. These stories are true. At the time, I said to myself that what I did was okay because I never showed a woman my dick without asking first, which is also true. But what I learned later in life, too late, is that when you have power over another person, asking them to look at your dick isn't a question, it's a predicament for them. The power I had over these women is that they admired me, and I wielded that power irresponsibly. I have been remorseful of my actions, and I've tried to learn from them and run from them. Now I'm aware of the extent of the impact of my actions. I learned yesterday the extent to which I left these women who admired me feeling badly about themselves and cautious around other men who would never have put them in that position. I also took advantage of the fact that I was widely admired in my and their community, which disabled them from sharing their story and brought hardship to them when they tried, because people who look up to me didn't want to hear it. I didn't think that I was doing any of that because my position allowed me not to think about it. There is nothing about this that I forgive myself for, and I have to reconcile it with who I am, which is nothing compared to the task I left them with. I wish I had reacted to their admiration of me by being a good example to them as a man and given them some guidance as a comedian, including because I admired their work. The hardest regret to live with is what you've done to hurt someone else, but I can hardly wrap my head around the scope of hurt I brought on them. I'd be remiss to exclude the hurt that I've brought on people who I work with and have worked with whose professional and personal lives have been impacted by all of this, including projects currently in production. The cast and crew of Better Things, Baskets, The Cops, One Mississippi, and I Love You, Daddy. I deeply regret that this has brought negative attention to my manager, Dave Becky, who only tried to mediate a situation that I caused. I brought anguish and hardship to the people at FX who have given me so much. The Orchard, who took a chance on my movie, and every other entity that has bet on me through the years. I brought pain to my family, my friends, my children, and their mother. I have spent my long and lucky career talking and saying anything I want. I will now step back and take a long time to listen. So, I'm sure people will pick this apart a million ways and have, many bones to pick with it. But I think it's a good statement. But then again, I'm very biased because I liked Louis C.K. Before all this came out. And, I mean, obviously, you can't bring this up or ask anybody involved because it just seems like next level impolite. But he says he asked all of them if he could show them his dick. And then, the story makes it seem like they said no, and then he took it out anyway. Or they didn't say anything, and it was like super awkward, and then he took it out anyway. I think a lot hinges on what their reaction was. If he asks and they say yes, and then he does, that's a totally different story than if he asks and they say no and he does, or if he asks and they say nothing and they're just uncomfortable and he does. Like each one of those situations is very, very different in my opinion. But I think his point about the power dynamic is true, and I think that's one that a lot of people overlook or kind of brush aside. But yeah, when you have a tremendous amount of power over somebody else, in the case of Weinstein, you literally control their career. You can't fucking like use that to get sex out of them. I mean, I guess in some instances, if the woman's a willing participant, or if the person is a willing participant, you can say, if everything's consensual, that it's unethical, but it's not illegal, But I don't know, whether or not it's illegal depends a lot on their response. If they're an unwilling participant, then you're talking about something that's illegal. I think many of the instances with Weinstein and the audio that was released kind of proves that a lot of the women were unwilling participants. So what he did may have crossed the line into what's illegal. With Louis C.K. here, it all hinges on what the response was. Even if we all agree it's super unethical for somebody wielding that power to whip out their dick, their response is actually very important. If they don't say anything and they're just uncomfortable, that's one thing. If they say no when he does it, that's illegal. If they say yes and he does it, and then they come to regret it and he feels bad about it, again, that's also a very different thing. So I don't know. Maybe I'm getting too much into the nuance of these kinds of stories, and people will question whether or not he's being remorseful simply because these stories came out, or if he, on some level, actually does feel remorseful. But, I'll let everybody else make that decision. But here you have it. Here's Louis C.K.'s response to the sexual assault allegations.